Let me just put a few clarifying thoughts before I get started. Yes, so you said that I'm doing it outside the academic, mainstream approach, and there are some, minor and major reasons for that. And the major reason is that there is very little openness in the Western academic world to explore alternative approaches, especially if they challenge the materialism of modern science. Right. So alternatives are acceptable in today's academic thinking, as long as they remain conformant to the mainstream materialistic ideology. Right. So if you have an alternative approach, there is absolutely no openness. So what that means is that even if you try to publish, and I have tried to publish things, they get I mean they never get published. So that's the major reason. There are some smaller minor reasons also, which I will not go into at this time. So let's begin with instead of trying to sort of keep clarifying this and that, let's understand what the knowledge is, right? What the philosophy is, what it says, and how we can understand it and apply it in the context of science, right? Once we have that grasp and understanding, then a lot of other questions which are smaller, subordinate questions, they become very we don't have to dwell on them so much. We can focus on. So Sankhya is one of the 6 systems of philosophy. And if you have heard of Indian philosophy, then there's something called Shad Darshan, 6 philosophies. And these philosophies have been deeply or greatly neglected for over thousands of years, except for what is today known as Vedanta. So Vedanta is one of the 6 systems. So there are 6 systems. So there's Vedanta, there is Sankhya, there is Yoga, there is Nyaya, there is Vaisheshika, and Mimamsa. And there has been a deep historical neglect except for Vedanta. And Vedanta also came into prominence because Shankaracharya picked it up and said that this is the conclusion of all Vedic philosophy. And after that, there has been greater attention given to it by other schools of philosophy. So that system has persisted. But other systems like Sankhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, and Yoga have been neglected. Now, you might say yoga is not neglected. A lot of people are practicing yoga, right? What they're practicing is not what the yoga philosophy is, right? And so one of the key things that I'm doing at the moment is translating all the original Sanskrit texts into English so that everybody can read, because and presenting scientific commentary. So there is a tradition in our system where people you translate the text and you can provide your comments on it, right? So the commentary is important because a lot of times these texts are presented as short sutras, like formulas, and if you don't know the context, then it's very difficult sometimes to understand what they're saying. And there is a logical progression among these sutras. And if you don't understand the context, then you might interpret 1 or 2 sutras correctly. And then after some time, you get lost in the maze and everything stops to make sense. And that has been the fate of some of these texts and philosophies. People have tried to interpret them, understand them. Most of the time, these are Western interpreters who have done great injustice. They often inject their ridicules and lack of understanding if somebody doesn't understand something, they immediately don't say that I don't understand it. They say that there must be something wrong with the book itself, the text itself. And so, and in India also there is deep lack of understanding. So anyway, we are trying to solve the problem. I'm trying to solve the problem. So there is a commentary on Vedanta Sutra, which is called Conceiving the Inconceivable, and I will come to that if maybe sometime. What the historical evolution of Vedanta is, what the problem is, and how that problem compares to other problems in logic, epistemology, and philosophy, and even mathematics, and why it has become come to the point of inconceivable, that we have said in a system called Achintya Bheda Bhed, that reality is inconceivable. If we say it's inconceivable, then we are immediately throwing out science, because science relies on the idea that we can conceive, we can understand, we can explain, and things like that. So what are the basic needs of doing that? So instead of going into that, I wanted to give you this broader picture. And now let's turn to Sankhya. So Sankhya is one of the 6 systems of philosophy, and the literal meaning is numbers or counting. And in this, but if you study Sankhya, you'll also find a theory of matter, and a theory of perception and cognition and so on. So this idea of what numbers are and how we perceive the reality and what the reality is, these are intricately tied together. So if we take a literal counterpart or the closest counterpart of that philosophy in our modern understanding, there are 2 things that come very close. One is mathematics and the other is physics. So what I will try to do through this presentation is describe to you what the problem of numbers in mathematics is, and then try to describe some of the problems of physics. And I'll try to illustrate how these problems are very hard problems. They have persisted for centuries, and they require a new way of thinking, but that way of thinking is inaccessible or unwanted in the Western paradigm of thinking, right? So let's start with the nature of numbers. I'll try to minimize this and see if I can. Okay. So counting actually involves 4 steps, and modern mathematics wants to describe numbers in 1 step. And I'll just come to that. So what are these 4 steps? These 4 steps are, I will call them identification, distinguishing, sequencing, and labeling. Right? So I will describe each of these steps in the next subsequent slides. And modern mathematics is only interested in discussing how to label things. And the prior steps of identification, distinguishing, and sequencing, these are the foundations on which labeling occurs. But these 3 foundations are discussed in Sankhya, but they are completely ignored in modern mathematics. So what do we mean by identification? And just as a caveat, I discussed with Ram how to pitch this presentation, and he told me that the audience is both broad and deep, right? So there are some experts, and there may be some people who are not necessarily experts, or they may be interested in things like that. So it's kind of little difficult to pitch something that is both broad and deep in a very short span of time. So what I've tried to do is keep it at a high level, keep it intuitive, as well as not lose the rigor or correctness and accuracy, right? So I will describe some of these things in a very simple way. Doesn't mean this is trivial, right? So if you have further questions, we can take that towards the end. So what is identification? It's the idea that there are individual objects, there are things in this world. And we don't have to know what those things are. Like in this case, I have depicted an apple, but we don't have to know that it's an apple. All just we need to know is there is a thing. This is how pretty much classical physics and even modern mathematics is concerned. If you go back to some of the history of the foundations of mathematics, they'll talk about objects and they'll talk about classes. classes then become sets, and an object is simply something. It doesn't have to be anything. So you can say A, B, C, D. These are objects, right? So so this is an object. Now this is what we mean by identification. I have identified that there is an individual thing. I really don't know what it is. But this method sort of stops working if we have to ask you to distinguish two things. For example, if you have an apple that's kept on a table, then you have to say that an apple is different from a table, even though in your perceptual field, you can only see a set of sensations, right? You can see some color, some shape, some size, and things like that. How do you know this color is actually, an apple, and, the table, for example, in this case, the apple is red. The table will also be completely red. And this happens often in visual illusions where you cannot distinguish between, the object and, what's its background. You can say foreground and background. So we have to distinguish things. And that distinction requires us to invoke properties such as color, shape, size, taste, smell, and so on. In physics, and, all kinds of other properties are used, like energy, momentum, so on. So distinguishing requires us to invoke a property. And we attach these properties to, objects, right? And this thing, so object cognition, needs certain things, but at this time we just assume that it's an object. But distinguishing two things requires us to invoke a lot of properties. These properties then require concepts. For example, if you say, I'm you going to distinguish an apple and an orange based on some concept, that concept can be color, it can be shape, it can be taste or smell and things like that. Then once you have distinguished two things, then you are required to sequence them. And what is sequencing? It's essentially prioritizing something ahead of something else. Like you can say, and the sequencing is not just for objects, it applies to many things. Like you can say, my top priority right now is education, my next priority is my family, third priority is the nation, and so on. So by this whole process of prioritization, we come to what we can call a sequence. And each of these methods of prioritization requires a choice, right? So you can say that apple is first priority, orange is next priority, mango is third priority, or you can reverse that order. So these methods of prioritization are choice. And once you have prioritized them, then you sort of come to a sequence. So these are the three steps. You have identified, you have distinguished, and you have sequenced. And then the final step comes, which is called labeling. In that labeling, you say there's a first thing, there's a second thing, there's a third thing. And this is how you get first, second, third. Now, to be able to say first, second, third, you should have been able to say that there are two things, or in this case, there are three things. You should have separated out an apple and orange, and then you should have been able to distinguish them, identify them, distinguish them, prioritize them, and then you can label. Now, this labeling, which you call first, second, third, in ordinary arithmetic, we also call the ordinal numbers, which is the first, second, third. And if you can say there is one, first, second, third, then you can say in the counting ends there, you can say there are totally three things, which is called a cardinal number. And cardinality or count is the result of, using ordinal numbers. Now, there are further steps, people say numbers, there are number systems, like you can count to the basis of 10, or to the 2, basis of 16, and things like that. And we will not sort of go into that. We'll just talk about first, second, and third. Now, what is the fundamental difference between Sankhya and modern mathematics? And that basic difference is that Sankhya is focused on how to identify things, how to distinguish things, and how to sequence things. Sankhya is not interested in how do we label things. So there is no theory of what is 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that is why people sort of get confused and say, this is talking about numbers, but it is not talking actually about the numbers in which, in the way that modern mathematics talks about, right? And therefore, sometimes people also talk about there have been Indian mathematicians and who have done great things, and before West did it, and so on. But they are not able to connect this sort of mathematics, which is about equations and algebra and computation, to this more traditional system, which is far older and traditional, which is Sankhya philosophy, because they are not able to connect this. So there is this big discrepancy that even when people talk about so-called Indian mathematics, they are not going back to the foundation of what numbers are and how did we come up with these. They are more superficially into the same system of numbered understanding that is currently followed in the West. So Sankhya talks about how do we identify things, distinguish things, and sequence things. And then once you have done these three things, then you get labels. And then labeling is the result, but the foundation is something else. Now, there is a deeper anathema in Western mathematics, the understanding of numbers, where they do not want to discuss or go into a foundation that is based on identifying, distinguishing, and sequencing. So what do they want to do? They want to simply construct a foundation of mathematics based on labels alone, right? So this is a simple illustration of how foundations in mathematics are constructed. I'm not saying this is the only foundation, but it's a foundation that's based on set theory. There's a very elaborate system, but I have to put it in a single slide so that everybody can understand. So I just put it in a simple slide. So this foundation says that we will begin with something called zero. And what do we do with, how do we define zero? We say it's an empty set, right? So there is a history of how numbers are based on set theory. So zero is nothing but an empty set. Then one is a set which has one member, which is the empty set, right? So if you look at the first line, then open brace, close brace, that's an empty set. And then you have an open brace, close brace with one member, which is the empty set or the null set, that is one. And then subsequently, you can say that I will include 0 and 1 into a set, and that set has two members, which is 0 and 1, and we call that set as 2. Similarly, we can have a set that has 0, 1, and 2, and that set is called 3. Now, what is essentially going on here is that we have foregone that fundamental basis on which we intuitively, count things in an everyday sense. Because that counting is based on identifying things, distinguishing things, and prioritizing things. That way of counting has a human basis, it has a psychological basis, it has a mental and perceptual basis, but mathematics says we are not going to touch or understand or delve into any of that. We will simply try to do labels, right? So this is an attempt to create a foundation of mathematics using labels. What are labels here? There are two labels, open brace, close brace. By sequencing and combining all these labels, we are able to construct a variety of numbers. Now, what happens? We immediately get into a problem of circularity. And for example, if you say that I have a number called 0, the 0 needs two brackets, a left bracket and a right bracket. And this means that to define 0, I must have two brackets, and that requires me to define 2. Otherwise, if, for example, if you're writing a computer parser, a parser has to say that, it has to parse and look for a left brace. Then it has to say that until if I get one more left brace, then, it's another set. If I get a right brace, So there is a choice always. Is it a left brace or a right brace? That set of choices involves two things. But at this time, we are still with 0. We haven't defined 1. So how can we define 2? Right? So this is the problem of circularity in the sense that without defining 2, we cannot define 0. And yet to define 0, we are assuming the existence of 2. Similarly, if you go back to the previous picture and you start looking at 1, this 1 is actually 4 braces. So to define 1, I need 4 braces. That means, I have not yet defined 2. I have not defined 3, but I am already assuming 4. Similarly, if you go to, as you go to higher and higher numbers, you are leaping forward more in terms of numbers, and you're never going to. So this is the problem of circularity. Now, mathematics disregards this problem, and we, it keeps proceeding into the construction using labels. This eventually leads to the problem of Gödel's incompleteness. This is a big topic, and unfortunately, I cannot go into that. But if you're interested, I have a book on this what is the problem of Gödel's incompleteness, and how it is related to sets and things like that. But essentially, even without understanding what is Gödel's incompleteness, we can simply see a problem with the set theory, whereas I need to define 0, but I'm assuming 2. So why should we study Sankhya? And this question of why is very important. What Sankhya is, how can we understand it? These are secondary questions. The first question is, why should I do it? Right? What's the problem? And the problem is that foundation of mathematics is not in labeling. And mathematics is trying to create a foundation that's based on labels, but that foundation leads to Gödel's incompleteness. Right? So this is also well accepted, fact in modern mathematics. So if we want to create a foundation that is free of Gödel's incompleteness, or free of, paradoxes and contradictions in set theory and problems, and understanding the nature of numbers, we have to go back to thinking, how do we actually count? And that goes to identifying, distinguishing, and sequencing. Now, the issue is that to understand these 3 steps, we have to understand what is conscious perception, right? Because our senses and our mind and our psychology and whatever perceptual apparatus we have, that is used to distinguish, identify, and sequence. Right? So that is how we come to Sankhya. It is, because there is a problem in mathematics. That problem is related to the construction using labels and so on. So this is the basis. Now, having dwelt a little bit on the problem of the nature of numbers and how that relates to Sankhya, let's turn slightly to physics. And like similar to mathematics reducing the 4 steps into 1 step, physics also does the 4 steps into 1 step reduction. And I will show you or try to describe how that reduction happens. So there are 4 tiers of reality. There are 4 tiers of reality which are called by different names in different places. Okay. In some places, these realities are called Sthula Sharira, Linga Sharira, Sukshma Sharira, and Jivatma. Right? Sometimes they're called Vaikhari, Madhyama, Paśyanti, and Para. In yoga philosophy, this Vaikhari, Madhyama, Paśyanti, and Para, this terminology is used. And in Sankhya, Sthula Sharira, Linga Sharira, Sukshma Sharira, and Jivatma, this term is used. But we can connect these 2 things if we go back and understand what these things are. And I've described here a simple way to understand. This gross body, or what we call Sthula Sharira in Sankhya, is basically identifying stuff. And this body is, simply what you can call in physics objects. There are individual things. But the Ling Sharira, or the gendered body, is the senses, the mind, the intellect, and so on. They are the ones which are used to distinguish one thing from the other, which means you can ascribe them properties. So what we call the senses, they are different from the body, right? So your sense of smell, taste, and things like that. And why that is different is because that even when you are asleep, you can still see things. So your eyes are closed, but you are seeing. Similarly, you can feel fear or happiness, and things like you can see emotions. You can even cry. So you are feeling everything independent, even when the body is at rest. Your eyes are closed. Your ears are, nothing is hearing. It's totally silent. You are able to see, and that is taken to mean that the dreaming experience involves the sense, the mind, which is completely different from the body. But while the waking state, the body is used by the senses and the mind to perceive. Right? So it's a central problem of how you're able to see, feel, think, understand everything, even while dreaming, when none of the senses, none of the organs, so to speak, uh, are active. So there's a difference between senses and organs. So these senses, they are required for distinguishing. Similarly, the mind. And so there's a very sophisticated system of how this whole perceptual process works. I'll try to discuss that, give you a gist slowly, here, but it's very difficult to. And then there's a process of sequencing. Sequencing simply means prioritizing. Like, for example, I gave the example, you can say my job is more important, and then my family is important, then my nation is important, then philosophy and all are last, right? Maybe not important. So there's a system of prioritizing. This system of prioritizing is also a subtle body, right? It is there in each one because everybody is doing some prioritization of their own. And and there are many ways in which you prioritize, like even ideas. For example, if you're if you follow reductionism of modern science, then it will say, well, at the fundamental level there's only quarks and leptons, and from these quarks and leptons we create atoms, then we create molecules, from molecules we get biology, then we get life, and so on. So what is most fundamental? It's particle physics. And what is next fundamental is atomic theory, or you can say theory of atoms. Then what is next fundamental is chemistry, then biochemistry, then biology, and then sociology, economics, and so on. So you construct that. So that is also a method of sequencing, in which you have said what is more fundamental, you have chosen that by a process of reduction. So there is we can discuss this system, this is probably months and months of discussion if you want to do that. But I'll just cap it here and move to the next one. So the key point here is that the three kinds of bodies and the transcendental soul, these are the four levels, and there are similarly four levels here, and sequencing, distinguishing, and identifying. Now, what mathematics essentially does is that, just like everything is in mathematics is reduced to sequencing, identifying, distinguishing, we reduce that to what is called matter in physics. But before we understand that matter, it's important to understand what these four levels are. So let's use some time to understand that. So what is Vaikhari, or what is this thing that we call gross? Sthula is the word, but we can call it gross. So it's a space of individual things, but these things have no properties, or philosophy is called universals. And they're essentially in physics, like you can think of a space of particles, and these particles are all identical in classical physics, but actually they are not identical in Indian philosophy. There is a very sophisticated system of how to distinguish these particles, but at the present time, this is just a space of classical particles, you can say. The other important thing is, in Sankhya, these particles are conserved, right? Now, before I speak a little bit about conservation, we have to understand what do we mean by reality in physics, right? It's that reality term in physics has a very precise numerical definition, is that if something is conserved, then it is real. So energy is conserved, therefore it is real. Momentum is conserved, therefore it is real. Charge is conserved, therefore it's real. Mass is conserved, so it is real. But particles are not conserved. Okay, so they are not real. Now people may not understand because they say, hey, we have been studying particle physics, and but if something is not conserved, it is not real. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it is not real in a very precise scientific and mathematical sense, that it is not conserved, right? Now this conservation or the non-conservation of particles actually leads to what is called indeterminism in classical physics. So if you normally in school and colleges, what they teach is that particles, so you start with two particles, they collide, and both particles move away. And that time you apply conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, and so on, and then you say you get a result, and that result is deterministic. But imagine you have two particles, they collide, and the total energy and momentum is distributed into three particles, or four particles, or 100 particles. So if the particles are not conserved, then mechanics is non-deterministic. And the simple reason is, more number of particles are created, therefore energy is divided into more particles, momentum is divided into more particles. The result is, if you cannot say that the particles are conserved, you cannot even predict how many particles, and therefore you cannot predict the result, right? So it's generally, it's taught in schools and colleges and even sometimes in universities that classical physics is deterministic, and that is not true, because there is no fundamental principle in classical physics that says particles are conserved. Only there is energy, momentum, angular momentum conservation. So this is what we mean by Vaikhari. Vaikhari is something, there are particles and they are conserved, which is different from classical physics where there are particles and they're not conserved. Now, what is Madhyama? Madhyama is our vision of saying that there are particles and they have properties, right? So modern science uses properties like charge, mass, momentum, energy, and so on. And Sankhya uses different properties called smell, taste, sight, touch, and each of these have many, many divisions. So there is a system of hierarchy of how properties themselves are constructed. The similarity between these two things is that both science and Sankhya, they will say that these properties are conserved. So both of them are saying they're real, right? The difference is simply that physics will say, momentum is real, energy is real, angular momentum is real, and Sankhya will say none of that is real. The real thing is taste, touch, smell, sound, sight. Now, if you go into Western philosophy, which existed before Newton's formulation, and primer or primary discussions about what is empiricism and how knowledge can be acquired by observation, these discussions are happening. There are ample number of objections to this idea of what is called primary properties, right? So this distinction is created by John Locke. He talks about primary properties and secondary properties, and he says that taste, touch, sound, smell, sight, smell, and so on, they are secondary properties, and length, mass, momentum, energy, all these things are primary properties. Now the nomenclature is done such a way that primary sort of has it sort of indicates in a way that this is reality and secondary is something that's created. A philosopher said that, hey, you never actually perceive energy, you never perceive momentum. All you see is something called speed, and the way you know speed is that you see something moving, and then the way you know something moving is through sight or through touch. But you never actually know any of these properties. So how can you call these things real? And there is, at least a 500-year debate which is unsettled even today on how can you claim that any of these properties like mass, charge, energy, momentum, they are real. If anybody is interested, then I can go deeper into that. But otherwise, I'll just move on and say that there are two classes of properties, primary and secondary, according to the Western nomenclature. Sankhya says the secondary is real and the primary is unreal, and science says that the primary is real and the secondary is unreal. Right? So, if somebody has looked at the Sankhya and Science book, this is the thing that we start discussing from. Now, what is so one more thing? So we got particles with we got particles with properties, but there is no sequence between them. There is no order between them. It's just a space. You don't know where the which one is first, which one is second, and so on. That thing comes in when you inject a coordinate system into the space, right? So you say that origin is the first. And then I will, let's say, count things along the x-axis first, then along the y-axis next, along the z-axis. So then you start. So basically, to say that there are a system of particles which have some properties, then how do you sequence them? This arises when you inject a coordinate system. And so now you get all the three things. You got individuals, you got their properties, and you got a sequence between them. Now you can count. Right? So, because physics assumes that there are particles, there is a space, and there is a, not just space, there is a coordinate system using with which we can count. Therefore, what you see, what you are told, or what we are taught in schools and colleges is this very simple system where you say there is a space coordinate system and particles with properties, and that seems like just one thing. But there are layers of three levels that have gone into this construction, which are sort of not distinguished, discriminated. This is there is another distinction between Sankhya and physics, which is that we say that these coordinate systems are conserved. So they are real for Sankhya, but they are unreal for physics. Okay, and what I mean by that is, like, for example, I talked about we having a prioritization system. There is a lot of divisions, subdivisions into what kinds of sort of prioritization systems we have. So we have one prioritization system for ideas, another system for actions. Which action should be done now, which should be done later, right? Similarly, we have a prioritization system for our desires. What desire should I fulfill today, what tomorrow, what later, what is my long-term goal, what is my short-term goal, etc. So there are many ways in which we are ordering things. Similarly, which think is more important, which is less important, what is near, what is far. So there are many systems of prioritizing, and all these systems are conserved. So we say it's real because it is conserved. And this conservation, it becomes a big problem of liberation and things like that, because whatever choices you have made in the past, they interfere with the choices in the future. And so we'll briefly discuss that if somebody is interested. But that's the connection between this thing and the spiritual understanding. So anyway, now what is we call the para? So we talked about Vaikhari, Madhyama, Paśyanti, and para. Now this para is basically choosing a prioritization system, right? So I can say that I have a priority in which my career is more important, my family is next important, my nation is next important. That's a prioritization system. But I can change my priorities. That priority is, the idea is that all these prioritization systems are already existing. It's like a space of coordinate systems. And what we call the Paśyanti is a space of coordinate systems. And in that space, there is a choice by which a coordinate system is selected. And thereby a system of priorities is selected. And by that prioritization, selection of system of priorities, we create an order in which you say this is more important, less important, this is near, that is far. And from that, you perceive properties. Even property perception is, you can say that I focus more on color and I look at shape next. Somebody can say I look at shape first and I look at color next. Similarly, I can say that I will distinguish things. I'll go to a shop and I'll look at the quality of things, and if I like it, price doesn't matter. Somebody else can say I will look at the price first and then I will look at the quality. Right? So this perception or this counting, this ordering and sequencing and numbering problem is an extremely complicated problem. But because it's simplified or reduced to labels, we don't understand. So so what science does is essentially it says that this coordinate system is nothing other than a particle, right? So, and because the particles are not conserved, therefore the coordinate system is also not conserved. And therefore, whatever we call the soul or things like it becomes a particle. Particle is not conserved, therefore soul is not real. So in one picture, we can draw a simple comparison of, just like we did for mathematics and Sankhya. We said that there are 4 levels of, by which you arrive at a counting or a number. And in physics, this is what happens. There are 4 levels still. The particles, their properties, their priorities, which you can call a coordinate system. And there's a choice of a coordinate system. In Sankhya, we'll say all these 4 things are conserved. So particles are conserved, properties are conserved, priorities are conserved, and choices are conserved. In physics, you say only the property is conserved. The particles are not conserved, which just leads to indeterminism in all of physics. Then you say even the coordinate systems are not conserved. And of course, there is no observer because the observer is nothing but a particle, and that particle is not conserved. So just like in mathematics, these sequencing, distinguishing, identifying are just reduced to a label. In this case, even the fourth thing, which is the soul or the observer, is reduced to a label. So if you say, "Who are you?" Nobody generally says, "I am an Atma." They will say, "My name is so and so." So who are you? "Oh, I am Ashish Dalela." What is Ashish Dalela? It's a label. It's a label, which is a name. You can also say, number. Just like you get Aadhaar card and you get a number. So who are you? What is your personality? It doesn't matter. What are your choices? It doesn't matter. What is how you perceive things, your individuality, all that doesn't matter. You are reduced to a number. So this is, and that's how society runs today. And because you don't ask what those things are, just reduce everything to a number. So you get a number and then you get all the details subsequently. So this is also happening in physics, right? So you say, what is this object? And you would essentially say it has some number which is mass, it has some number which is charge. So it's a collection of numbers, and this collection of numbers can essentially be in a suitable ordering system. It can also be reduced to one number. And so all that you get is, what is reality? It's a collection of numbers, right? In that system, a particle is equal to a property, is equal to coordinate system, is equal to choice, and finally everything is a number. Right? Now, some people might say, no, physics has conception of properties, like we'll say there is mass, energy, momentum. The answer is no. These concepts that we use in physics, like let's say you say mass. What is mass? Okay, nobody can explain actually what mass is. All that we say is that if you want to measure mass, go to Paris. There is a standard kilogram kept in a museum. That kilogram is what we mean by mass. If you measure against that kilogram, that is the definition of mass. And this is a big philosophy. It's called operationalism. There is a Nobel laureate, who was the pioneer of this philosophy. And what they essentially said is that he was trying to measure pressures. His name is Peter Bergman, and he was trying to measure pressures. And he said, I get a gauge, to measure pressures, but it fails after a certain number. When the pressure increases, then the gauge stops working. Therefore, I don't know if the gauge is wrong or the pressure is or the value that it's indicating is correct. Therefore, there is no meaning to pressure other than the gauge. So if I have to pick the right gauge, that gauge itself means pressure. That defines what we call pressure. So this is not something trivial that we are taught in school and colleges, that science, there's a property called mass and charge and things like that. Answer is no. There is no such property. It's just language that we use to create some philosophical system. But ultimately, if you go down to the brass tacks, it'll say every property is nothing but an object. That object is not also a general concept. It is a specific thing that is kept in some museum. Okay. So everything comes down to a label or a number. Now, what Sankhya does essentially, it describes a system of hierarchies, right? And we saw 4 levels in hierarchy, where you start with particles, then you get properties, then you get an ordering system, then you get a choice of an ordering system. So this is not the end. There are many levels inside this hierarchy, right? So again, Paśyanti para, Vaikhari, Madhyama, Paśyanti para. There's a complicated system. There are 16 ways of identifying what we mean by particle. This is what is called, and there are 24 ways of distinguishing based on different kinds of properties. There are eight methods to sequence. Like I talked about, there is a method to distinguish your desires, your knowledge, your activities, and so on. So there are 8 different methods. Similarly, there are two methods of that method is accept and reject, which you can call a choice. There are two methods by which you can pick a sequencing system. So each of these methods are uh, comprised of many individual levels. For those who kind of know or nuanced into this whole system, if you add these up, the 16 plus 24 plus 8 plus 2 is a 50. This is very closely tied to our system of language, in which we said there are 50 alphabets. All these alphabets are indicating some property, some method of distinguishing, some way of identifying something, or some way of choosing. And these 50 alphabets constitute what we call the Sanskrit alphabet. I'll not delve into that, but just as a side question. Now, this is not again enough. Each of these levels is divided by further three modes. Like I can give you an example of what is a car. So a car can be described in three ways. And this problem, if you're interested, it again comes up in mathematics. So you can say, what is a number? So you can say, what is 2? And sometimes you say 2 is a general concept. Sometimes you say 2 is a specific individual. And sometimes you can even, in computer programming, you can even treat 2 as an instruction, right? So if you have uh, fundamental instructions, so they are also labeled by numbers. So when you get a program, you get ones and zeros. They are numbers, but they are not quantities and they are not concepts. They are instructions, right? So similarly, this idea, this problem actually leads to many paradoxes in computer science and as well as in mathematics. So this is what the book Gödel's mistake discusses, because we can use number as a concept, as a quantity, and as an instruction. And these three ways are essentially due to the three modes of nature. And these three modes can be intuitively explained. You can say, what is a car? You can say car is nothing but a set of properties, some shape, some size, some weight, some color. This is what we call knowing the car. And somebody can say, no, but what if the car just something looks like a car, but it never works? Can you really call that a car? So he said, no, car must also run on the road to transport some people. So that is also a definition of car. And then you can say, well, you have just defined, concept as some set of properties. Maybe it's a design, maybe it can be designed, but there are no actual cars. So then there's a third mode, is called the thing mode. So there are three modes. There is an idea mode, there's an activity mode, and there's a thing mode. The same thing exists in numbers also. You can treat number as a thing. You can treat it, as an activity, and you can treat it as an idea. Now, when when Gödel constructed his incompleteness proof, he used the thing mode and the idea mode, right? So he took sentences and he labeled them to digits. So he said, this is a sentence, it has a meaning, and then let's label that to a number, which is called the Gödel's numbering thing, or Gödel's numbering scheme. And that, using that scheme, he created a contradiction between an idea and a thing, right? And that contradiction is essentially like saying, let's say you have somebody named Mr. Barber. Okay, his name is Mr. Barber, but he is not a barber, right? He may be a carpenter, or he may be something else. Then there is somebody called Mr. Carpenter, who is actually a barber, right? So you can have a name that is not the nature of the thing, and you can have a nature of the thing which is incompatible with the name. So that requires you to say that there is a mode in which I will think about the thing, and there is a mode in which I'll try to understand the property. The name and the meaning are two different modes, but you can't do that with numbers, right? So this is the source of many paradoxes in mathematics. In any way, so there are there are four levels in which that there are sub levels, and in each sub level there are many modes. So it's a very sophisticated, and every problem of philosophy or mathematics or physics is addressed. Everything is, it's a necessary, thing. It's not something superficial, or we just added it for the heck of it. Now, instead of going and delving into this hierarchy and description and all these details, it's a very long and complex process. I will simply try to summarize what this hierarchy essentially achieves and try to see what it means for physics. So what does hierarchy achieved? Essentially, it transforms independence into dependence. And what we mean by that is that if you study classical physics, you will be taught about something called independent particle. All the particles are independent. So the first thing we teach in Newton's first law is that there is an independent particle. So there is only one particle in the whole universe, right? You can visualize like that. And that we call that as a free particle. And we say that, particle undisturbed by any forces continues on its trajectory of motion. That's the first law of Newton's first law. What is Newton's first law essentially saying? It is saying that the world is comprised of independent particles. And then there is force on it and things like that. But the reality essentially is all independent particles. That is what that's what continues into classical physics, all over classical physics, until you get into quantum physics, where this fundamental idea that there are independent particles itself is challenged. And because things are no longer independent, they are no longer even interacting through forces, right? So the second premise that there are independent particles interact with forces. So this problem of non-independence, which was postulated, or independence was postulated in classical physics, begins to break down, and we are not able to understand why it breaks down, because we have assumed that things are independent, right? Now hierarchy, what it does is it transforms that sort of independent concept into something called dependence. Now this dependence is relative. If you have steep hierarchy, then you have a lot of dependence. If you have if you have no hierarchy, then this is complete independence. So this hierarchical description of matter creates structures in addition to what we can call particles or things. These structures themselves have interactions, which is completely different laws of science about how structures interact with each other. Right? You can think of two companies, two organizations, two governments. They have structural, and there are a lot of people who study systemic behaviors, which is to say that doesn't matter who the person is in the government or who the person is in the organization, the structure of the organization is such that the person is helpless, right? So this is the structural way of thinking. Then I'll make the final point is that all of classical physics and even quantum physics is based on this fundamental idea of uniformity of space and time, uniform homogeneity and isotropicity of space and time. So what does it mean? You're taught this law of conservation of momentum, right? What is this law actually? Is there really a law? The answer is this law of conservation of momentum is nothing but saying that the space is homogeneous, which means that the distance between point 1 and point 2 is equal to the distance between 2 and 3, 3 and 4, and things like that. So what happens if you compress this? What happens if we elongate it? The answer is we can never know, because we are inside that space. So conservation of momentum is nothing but the hypothesis that space is uniform. Similarly, conservation of angular momentum is nothing but the hypothesis that all the directions in space are all the directions in space are the same. Similarly, conservation of energy is nothing but the hypothesis that all moments in time are nothing but they're essentially identical. So there is, like, you go 100 years from now, you can say history has time has passed and things like that, but essentially time is what we call time in the physics sense, is all the same. So I've talked about this, but if you delve into this, you can say that physics is simpler. There's particle and four properties, essentially all these properties reduced to what we call space. The answer is Sankhya also is just the understanding of the nature of space. But that space is immensely complicated because it tries to explain all our experience. It's a simple example. We construct a coordinate system to say what is first, second, third, fourth, but that is only for particles. What if we say that, hey, you have desires and can you prioritize your desires? You have ideas, can you say which is a more fundamental idea? You have activities, can you say which should you do now, which should you do later, which should you not do, right? So if you take that full conscious experience and then try to fit it into the paradigm of coordinate systems, obviously that system will not work, right? And so this is necessary complexity. And so now let's, I'll just, there I have, I think, four more slides. I'll try to apply these ideas of hierarchy to scientific problems. Okay. So let's illustrate, there's a second law of thermodynamics, which says that entropy always increases, right? Now, what is entropy increase essentially? It is saying that the total energy is conserved, which is the first law of thermodynamics. The second law says the entropy increases. So total property, which is properties in energy, is an example here. That is conserved, but the particles are not conserved. And if you go into statistical thermodynamics, you can study this, that this any system is drawn into a phase space. The phase space, can expand or contract. That contraction or expansion of the phase space is essentially the number of particles are increasing, right? So physically, you can say that energy is the same, but phase space is expanding. That expansion is called entropy increase. That's number of particles are increasing. So what is this entropy change? Is essentially number of independent particles have increased. And how can they increase? Because classical physics this is okay with classical physics, because classical physics or Newton's physics never said that particles are conserved, right? That claim was never made. So in thermodynamics, that claim is upheld and said, well, it is not conserved, but we are saying it can increase. And that's therefore classical physics and thermodynamics they make slightly different statements, but they're totally compatible. But the issue is nobody knows why the number of particles should increase, right? So there's some reversible processes where the particles don't increase. There are some irreversible processes. So we just say that it's a law of nature. The law of nature is not said that entropy will increase. The law of nature is that entropy cannot decrease, right? So, second law is more appropriately stated by saying the entropy shall never decrease. So if you want to think of, Sankhya, and try to apply this to thermodynamics, we will think about this problem in a completely different way. And we will say that particles are not increasing, they're not decreasing, right? Because these particles are conserved. What is changing is that the particles are becoming more independent or dependent. So if they become more dependent, the hierarchical structure is created and you call that order. Similarly, if they become less, dependent or more independent, hierarchies decrease, you call that chaos or disorder. And that's what you map to entropy increase and decrease. So essentially, what is happening is in some systems, in physical processes like engines and things like that, entropy is said to increase, and that's essentially our way of thinking would be that its independence is increasing, which means the structure or what you call the order is breaking down. And these terms like order and disorder have the structural connotation, but nobody uses that in a real physics sense. They just use it in the sense that number of possible states which are defined in the phase space is expanding, therefore entropy is. But if you think in terms of this structural, way of notion, then you can say that nature is not necessarily headed toward disorder, which means that entropy need not always increase. It can also decrease. And that decreasing is to say that if the hierarchical structure increases, then the entropy can decrease. So just by changing the way you describe order and disorder as hierarchy or non-hierarchy, you can say that entropy need not always increase. It can also decrease, and that system of increase can exist in other systems such as biological systems. And that has huge implications for how we understand life and biological systems. Then the next thing is quantum probability problem. This is again a big, I have done an interpretation of quantum theory, if somebody's interested. It's a multifaceted problem, but let's just talk about what a simple problem which is called non-locality. And this non-locality is essentially non-independence, right? So This creates a big problem because we are used to thinking in terms of classical physics where everything is independent, right? You have two electrons, one has a positive spin, plus half spin, the other one has a minus half spin, and we think that these are independent things. But we don't, in Sankhya, we would say it's a hierarchical structure, it's part of a system. That system is, what we mean by the system is there is a third thing which actually creates this structure. And that third thing, so if you change the state of one particle, the state of another particle is also changed. Now that thing, that the third thing is not a hidden variable. Is I want to make that point because if some, you know, people are there, they might immediately think of it as it's a hidden variable. It's not a hidden variable. It's the way you create structures, and that requires some deeper delving into the nature of Sankhya, that these particles are actually symbols of meaning. And I can give you an a simple example. You can think of a book, right? So you are doing a quantum measurement, and right now we think of it as a physical system of particles, but you can also think in terms of a book. So a book has, if you don't understand the book, what the book's meaning is, you can say that there's a 2% probability that the word "the" will occur in this book. There's a 0.5% probability that the word "probability" will occur in this book. So in this way, you can reduce a book to a recurrence of probabilities of the words or alphabets, whichever way you prefer. So, but the book is not simply a system of probabilities. It is actually a structure which has a hierarchy. It has hierarchical structure, which is basically chapters divided into sections and subsections and paragraphs and sentences. So there's a hierarchical structure. But if we flatten this structure, we say there is no hierarchy, then all that we can do with is, I can only predict that the word X, or the word ensemble will occur with some probability, the word existence will occur with some probability, and all that I get is certain probabilities. But if you want to solve the probability problem, you have to say there is a structure. In that structure, the things that are in the dominant position, for example, the book is about physics, you can say particle and wave, these two words will occur more frequently in a book on physics. But if you were talking about the book on economics, then the word money and free market will occur frequently, right? So that depends on. So again, quantum probability problem is essentially, in our way of thinking, is about we looking at matter as something without meaning. We treat matter as a stuff or box or object or whatever. But we look at, Sankhya will look at the same world and saying we are reading the world like the book is being read, right? So we study the nature like a book, whereas physics studies the nature as, instead of reading the book, it says what is the weight of the book, what is the mass, what is the length of the book, what is the height of the book. So there's a difference between studying the book as length, weight, mass, and reading the book, right? And if you are going to simply measure length, weight, mass, and things like that, you cannot understand what the book is. Therefore, that system is horribly incomplete. You have to start reading the book, then you can understand why the words occur in a particular sequence. So I'll just, this has been long. I think I maybe overstepped my time, but this is just a glimpse. I have several books, and I can, if you're interested, there are numerous applications of a new way of thinking about this to ordinary subjects like cosmology, chemistry, social sciences, number theory. I've applied these ideas to several fields, and in each field, there are two things that you can do. One is you can demystify the problems that nobody else is able to demystify, right? And then you can even say that how you can solve this problem, right? So both things you can do. That is, as Ram was saying in the beginning, that is the way to do science without saying, we did science in the past, okay, and we don't know what to do now, or saying that we were better in the past and you stole from us, or saying that I don't care about you. All these things are not required. We can do better science today in the areas where you are failing or somebody, materialism is failing. So we can do better. This is a different, it's a scientific approach, but it is still outside the current materialism, paradigm, which is sort of irrational and empirical, because it's a dogmatic system where you say that I will not look at anything other than, the way I have been looking at things in the past. Right. So that needs a change, and India can, Indian universities, Indian education system, you can say that we have thought about these things in the past. We have a different approach to these things, right? This approach we can drive and we can demystify the problems. I'm not bringing in, soul or God or spirit or, mind unnecessarily. It is necessary complexity. I'm bringing that, and it is useful complexity, right? Because I'm able to demystify your problems, I'm able to solve the problems, and I'm able to show how they can be solved, right? So this is, I'll halt here and I'll take questions. I hope this was useful. By the way, I have a website. It's called shabda.co. You can go there. There are several things there. There are some lot of blogs you can read about if you're interested. There is a place you can ask questions if you're interested. There's the forums. So it's forums.shabda.co. You can have discussions. Many people come there and ask a lot of things. And there are other things also, but and there's a books. So everything is on shabda.co. It's very easy to remember. So I'll stop here, and Ram, over to you.
Thank you, Ashish, for this wonderful presentation. So let's go to our interested audience. Dr. Tanushri Basak. Ma'am, you raised your hand.
Yes.
So please
Yeah, I have raised my hand. Yeah. Sir, Ashish sir, you have just given a wonderful talk. We have never heard or thought this kind of correlation between modern science and Sankhya, because maybe we are not aware of these things. So I have a few questions, and it's one similarity I just found. Maybe it's you can better comment if it's correct or not. Like
Okay.
you described the way Sankhya. Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, perfectly.
Okay, so yeah, you describe the way how Sankhya works. Means first we need to identify, then we need to distinguish, and then we have to
Sequence.
support the sequence, right? So isn't it similar to the way statistical mechanics works? So we identify the particle and then distinguish it. Means the classical statistics, if we see that this is going the same way, we are not labeling that first, but rather we identify, then distinguish, then sequence. We can say that that is a way how the states can be organized.
Yeah, so I also
And
said that when you, for example, when you put a coordinate system, okay,
yes,
in that coordinate system, there is an assumption that, let's say, even to take a straight line, you can say point 2 is after the point 1, point 3 is after the point 2. I'm not saying this is
yes,
not empirical. Yes, it is always empirical. We are applying some of these ideas intuitively to science. But if you go to fundamental theories on how these things are happening, then what happens is, if you go to foundational number theory, they said there's nothing like 1 and 2. Okay.
yes.
What is 1 is 4 brackets. What is 2 is another 8 is 8 brackets.
But what I mean to say means in that is true for mathematics, but in physics we go this way sometimes. In some of the theoretical studies, we do identifying, distinguishing, and then sequencing, and finally labeling.
Yeah, you do that. But what I'm saying is that, do you say that this method of identification, that let's say you ordered something, okay, you say, let us
Hmm.
make a choice of a coordinate system. Is that who made the choice? We don't ask that. Okay, I made the
Yeah,
choice, and
that's
we
true.
will put that in the paragraph. We say, let us suppose we make this thing. Okay, that doesn't mean we explained how that and who the choice is made. That in the paper you say Tanushri, Basak had made this choice, and her name will be there, and people will say, yeah, Tanushri made this choice. But does that mean physics is explaining how that choice was made? No.
No, no, true.
Right? So the human aspect, or the way this thing is happening, is remains, in science also, there are a lot of things that are outside science and they are conveniently used in science, but without actually recognizing. So if you say, I thought like this, yeah, in every paper, you can say, we think, I think, we postulate.
True.
But
Yeah.
if you ask, hey, what do you mean by think? Can you explain that in
Hmm.
physics? Nobody wants to do that. Why?
Yes.
Because the mind is by definition outside the body. It has got nothing to do with the body. So you can say in a
Yes.
physics paper, we think, I think, we postulate, we did, but you cannot say what is the meaning of thinking or what is the meaning of postulating, or you can say we want. Okay, so physics guy, can you explain, what is desire? Or you can say we
No.
feel this is the way to go forward. So what is feeling? So the ordinary language is used in physics, okay, in physics journals, but that doesn't mean it is physics.
Yes, sir. It's the way you have introduced today the things that is totally different. We haven't thought in this way.
Okay.
So I'm really, yeah,
No, no,
it's
that's
a
fine.
really pleasure to,
Yeah.
yeah, listen to you.
Yeah.
Sir, would you like to comment more on the ways, means you were telling that there are two type of properties. One is the primary and secondary you were defining.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the primary properties, like in physics, we call that mass, energy, momentum, those are as the primary
Yes.
properties and we use the conservations.
Yes.
But you have introduced some different concepts. Can you elaborate more on that?
No, so it's the same concept. This distinction comes from, see, you have to go a little bit into the history of Western science or European science. As Ram was explaining at the beginning of the talk, that this came out of what is called enlightenment, right? And why is it called enlightenment? Is because the previous time was called dark ages. Okay. So you designate some time as dark ages, and why is it called dark ages? Because it was a period of religion and theology and things like that, and it was a lot of dogma and science was not moving forward. So they said that is dark ages. Of course, when they're going through that, they never said it is dark ages. Only when they come to the point of having a different idea, then they say previous age was dark age and now we are enlightened. Okay, so these are all terms. But what is really enlightenment? It is saying that we are not going to worry about questions of soul and God, mind, choice, perception, human bias. All these things we are going to keep out of it. So the fundamental problem is all these things starts with taste, touch, smell, sound, sight. So you can say it is yellow and red and I feel like that, or it is sweet. So they say, let's start by removing your sense perception itself from the discourse of science. Okay. So all the sense perception properties are called secondary properties. Secondary means less important. Technical term is secondary. The implication is it is less important. Mass, charge, energy, momentum, length, time, clock, all these things. These are primary properties. The technical term is primary. The implication is it is important. Right? So this
Okay.
is the distinction that is drawn between primary and secondary property. The criticism of David Hume and George Berkeley and many of these guys who are early empiricists, they said that, like George Berkeley said, esse est percepi. The essence of anything is to be perceived, right? So, for example, if you see a flower, what you're seeing is taste, touch, colors. Even if you say there is a particle, you never see the particle actually, right? Even in quantum physics, for example, you say there is an electron. No, what you see is, a detector that is goes lighted up or unlighted. That's what you see. You don't see an electron.
Yes,
Okay.
true.
So you hear a click, that is sound. Or you hear, something being pushed, that is touch. You don't see an electron, you don't see a proton. So these are, but scientists would like to say that we still want to postulate the reality of this, primary properties, just because we want to get out of this realm of, human concepts, or because they are ultimately tied to more deeper concepts which then lead to religion.
Okay.
So that is the basis. It is an attempt to come out of the grips of, religion. And the way you get out of is, if you don't have to talk about soul, and if you don't have to talk about soul, you should not talk about mind. To not talk about mind, you should not talk about sense perception.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is a very, it's a very crafty and a long route. It took them, a very long time to come to this point. So I would not be surprised if we take that long time to reverse it.
Another thing is that you mentioned that according to Sankhya, that quantum mechanics can be non-probabilistic.
Yes, it can be non-probabilistic. And I gave you the example that just like if you have a book, if you understand what the book is, how the sentences are, how the words are, okay, you don't say that this sentence just randomly appeared there. You say that if you're reading a book, you can say that any sentence could have appeared. All these sentences are in a superposed state, and one of the superposed state collapses, and one sentence magically appears. Do we say that while
But
reading a
my
book?
question is, I understood this one, but my
Yeah.
question is, if quantum mechanics is going to be non-probabilistic, then can we explain the quantum entanglement or these correlations? Wouldn't it be difficult conceptually if that
Yes,
is
we can
not
explain.
probable?
Yeah, we can explain that. That's what my book, Quantum Meaning, it does that. First of all, we have to understand what these problems are. Okay. And we have to understand. So, a lot of interpretations do that. Okay. There are close to 50 interpretations of quantum mechanics. All of which try to explain what the quantum problem is. But none of the interpretation actually says that we can solve the problem.
Okay.
It is like saying that I now understand the problem in a way that I have accepted the problem. So everybody has a problem with the problem, and how to accept it is, what they're trying to solve. So there are many interpretations which try to make the problem palatable, which is what I can say. There are many interpretations. Then there is an interpretation which I have done, which says the problem is non-palatable, and here is the way you can make it palatable. So there's a two different type of things. But answer is you can solve it. It needs a lot of work. Explaining it is very simple. Solving it is hard.
Okay. It's really nice interacting with you, sir. Thank you.
No problem. I'm happy you have benefited from it.
Ashish, I have one question.
Yeah.
Now, when you say that modern science and modern science is dependent on empirical data, on measurement, the
Yes.
way they define science is, or they limit themselves is for empirical investigation only.
Right.
Whenever you go beyond empirical things, numbers and all that, and go to the subjective experiences, which
Right.
include mind, intellect, prana, or the deeper aspects,
Yeah.
then because you cannot measure those things, that's why it is not included in modern science by definition. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you try to bring Sankhya, an understanding of Sankhya to the modern science,
Yeah.
are we not reducing qualities into quantities? Are we trying to do that?
Okay. So let me explain. Like I was giving that example that science tries to measure things empirically. This is, partially incorrect, perception about science. It is in a way a propaganda about science that science is empirical. Let me explain. A proton and an electron is never seen by anybody. Okay. What you see is the effect of proton and electron. Okay. So the proton and electron is the cause, which you never see, but you see the effect, which is which is called observation or empirical measurement. So we can also say the same thing that you can. So science is okay. In fact, this is widely accepted in the enlightened circles of science that you can make any postulate, as long as it is useful in explaining the data. Which means to say, you may not see the cause, but if you can explain the effect using a postulate, that is scientifically acceptable. Right? But the low level propaganda of people who do not really understand science is that science is about empirical. So you can ask them, okay, where did you see electron? Did you see electron? No, you cannot see electron. You cannot see proton. Even like, you know, in economics, or, you know, in any subject, there are a lot of hypothetical concepts. Okay. And there is a philosopher called Willard Quine. He created this picture of, said that there are, in every subject, there are some core set of concepts, a center. Okay. And then beyond that central set of concepts, there is another layer of less central concept. Then there's another layer and the other layer. And this way, knowledge is constructed out of many layers. And you test this knowledge at the periphery. Okay. You only test this knowledge at the periphery. You never can question this core. Okay. Now we can change this idea slightly and say this core is actually the higher point, and then there is lower point, lower point, lower point. This is a hierarchy. And you are testing things at the lowest level, but the deeper realities you're not seeing. Okay. So just like you can have a, you know, spherical or, you know, circular structure, and there's a core which bound, you know, successive layers, you can also put that in the hierarchy. So let's just say there's an idea of a soul. Okay. Now the idea of a soul has a clear effect on the body. There's a living body and a dead body. Is it not perceivable? It's perceivable. So according to scientific, you know, understanding is that if I can postulate a cause which explains the effect, but it should explain the effect better than anybody else. Like if somebody is not postulating the soul and saying that I can explain death, and somebody is postulating the soul and still explaining death, this second explanation has to be better. Otherwise, we will not accept it, because you'll say, hey, it's a superfluous hypothesis. I don't need it. I can explain death even without that. So the second explanation has to be better. Okay. It doesn't mean the soul has to be empirical. It has to be ascribed those properties which explain death better, or life better, or something better. Right. So that is the criteria for science. This empirical and all is, you know, there are millions of, like space, for example. I can ask you, have you seen space? Nobody has seen space, right? I can ask you, you use mathematics. Have you ever seen empirically seen an equation? Have you seen gm1 m2 by r square? Nobody has seen that, right? Have you actually seen any empirical evidence for, you know, I mean, there are so many concepts like space, time.
Ashish, maybe we haven't seen the electron and, you know, all these minuscule particles, but we have language of mathematics that precisely describe, you know, how it operates, function, and you can pretty much know where they exist, how they exist.
Yes.
You count them. So maybe we don't have subtle tools to really see them, but we have subtle language to decode it.
Yes, precisely. So that language is a language of concepts, is a language of that theory also exists in Sankhya, or in broader system of Vedic philosophy. But the problem is nobody understands that theory, right? We are not understanding, like like common intuitive experience is that, let's say I can see the color yellow. Okay. But what does physics say? There is a photon. It travels into your eyes. It hits the eyes, an electrical signal is generated which goes into the brain. So what reached the brain? Electrical signal. Some electrons reached. How did that electron become yellow? We don't know that. Similarly, the taste, you taste fruit, it goes sweet. What is sweet? Okay, some apple touched your tongue, finally it generated an electrical signal, finally the electron went to the brain. That is also electron. But that electron is taste. It is sweetness. So some electron is yellow, it is color. Some electron is sweetness, it is taste. Some electron is shape, which is square. Some electron is touch, which is hot. It is the same electron. How can you say that some electron becomes taste, some electrons become touch, some electron becomes color? What is your explanation? The answer is we don't know. but we can measure electrons, so we will say it is electron, right? So there is a big difference between being an adequate explanation versus being an empirical measurement. Yeah, I can measure there is some current, like I can put an electric probe into your brain and I can see some electrons and current is flowing. That is empirical measurement. But that doesn't help me to explain why it is shape and size and color and smell and touch and all these things. And I'm not talking about sophisticated things like prana and thought and all, just sense perception, which everybody can have, right? So the answer to that is these electrons are also not, just electrons or current. They're actually symbols of meaning, right? So some electron is taste, some electron is touch, some electron is sight, they are encoding additional meanings. And that encoding of the meaning is what makes it probabilistic, because they are now become like symbols, like words. Like, so now you're not reading, random book. It's like a book which has words in sequence. Those words have meaning. So these electrons or whatever, I'm just using the word colloquially, all quantum objects have meanings. Does that answer the question?
Yes, pretty much. And that's, bring me to your next question is that when you distinguish it clearly, that modern science provides us physical view of reality, and Sankhya in contrast provides us semantic view of reality.
That is correct.
And when we talk about semantic view of reality, we bring meaning first, or meaning or consciousness first, and then from there it proceeds to matter.
Yes.
So just can you please, briefly elaborate on that?
Okay, so this idea that, see, in the West, there is this famous duality called the mind-body duality. It's a Cartesian duality. And that duality has existed for 400 years and nobody is able to solve the problem. Even when people talk about consciousness, they will eventually come down to this question, is consciousness different from matter? And even a lot of people in India, they are, Vedic system, they talk about consciousness different from matter. Okay, what they are thinking about matter is wrong. Their idea of consciousness may be okay. Okay, but this is where science is important. What is matter? Okay, so I'll give you an example. Like there is a table which I'm touching here. Okay, and normally if you ask what is this thing, people say it's some substance, padarth. Okay, it is some substance, it is something hard, and etc., etc. But we don't say it is like that. It is not this substance. It is actually atoms of sensations. Okay, so what is this table? It is comprised of some atoms of touch, some atoms of sound, some atoms of sight, some atoms of shape, color, things like that, right? And this is very tightly related to quantum problem. I can explain that through an example. Let us say I give you an apple, okay, and I say that you cut this apple into small pieces. Okay. So you cut the apple, you cut it into 2 parts, 4 parts, 8 parts, 16 parts, whatever. You go on cutting. Every piece of that apple that you get by cutting is a small apple or is a piece of apple. Okay. This is how we think of classical cutting. A piece of apple is a small apple. But there is another quantum way of, or another alternative semantic way of cutting is, if you cut the apple, I will separate the shape from the size, from the taste, from the color, from the smell. You understand? So there is another way of cutting the apple. It is not simply I cut the apple, I get small pieces of apple. I can also cut the apple in a way where I'll separate the shape from the color, from the size, from the smell, from the touch and all these things. So this other way of cutting is what happens when we get to really small particles. But science is thinking we are still cutting in the first way, which is I'm cutting the apple to create small pieces of apple. So there is a classical cutting and there is a semantic cutting. The semantic cutting is what happens when we do quantum physics, but people are thinking it is classical cutting. That's the whole problem, right? So going back to your point, even this apple is, if you cut it into small pieces, there are two ways of cutting. It's not small pieces of apple. It is taste, smell, sound, touch, sight, etc. So this is what Sankhya describes, is that there are these elements which are embodiment of sensations, right? It is like saying, just like you have picture on your photograph on your disk in a computer. That picture is ones and zeros. Those ones and zeros, if you read image theory, they'll talk about symbols. The symbols, they are pixels. Essentially, they make codes of symbols and colors and things like that. So each pixel is a symbol. So similarly, there are pixels of taste and smell and touch. And so this is what we mean by atomism, right? These are pixels. These are, but they're different from physical atoms. We don't talk about position, momentum, all these things. But if you want, you can also describe that atom incompletely in terms of position and atom. That's what happens. The uncertainty principle, probabilities, non-locality, entanglement. There are numerous problems.
Okay. Just one last question now, from my side at least. In one slide, you mentioned that in Sankhya, we have 16 way of identifying, 24 way of distinguishing, 8 way of sequencing, and 2 way of choosing.
Yeah.
This must be a very broad topic, but just, if it is possible for you to mention 2 way of choosing, what these 2 ways are.
Yeah, it's a simple answer, male and female.
Okay. Something related to Prakriti and Purush?
Not Prakriti. You can say Prakriti and Purush is also there, but desire also is, my fundamental desire is, there are two categories of desire. One is called wanting, the other is called needing. There's a third desire is called willing. And it's a very difficult topic, but let me just quickly explain, okay? Suppose, you say, I want to eat, okay? And then you say, I need to eat. And there's a third statement, I am willing to eat. So when you say, I want to eat, means I am actually not really hungry. I don't need to eat, but I want it. Then sometimes you can say, I need to eat, which means I am actually hungry. I am needy. And then you say, when I am willing to eat, okay, it means I don't want to eat. I don't need to eat, but if you give me food forcibly, I will eat. Okay. So this is what we call choice or desire. This is it's a very subtle and it's a very complex topic. Okay, but in a simple sense, the wanting desire is called masculine, the needing desire is called feminine, and the willing desire is called, neutral. Okay, so that's why we have 3 genders: Striling, Pulling, the Punsakling. This is not an arbitrary thing. It is not because we see today, like if you go and talk about this gender debate, they will say, oh, we don't know how many genders are there, right? They talk about LGBTQ, etc., etc. I think we'll run out of letters.
Well, they are 72.
Huh?
They are 72 now.
72 genders.
No.
Okay. So we have 3 genders.
Yes.
Okay. Striling, Pulling, Napunsakling. So there is a philosophy, there is a scientific basis on which we say, it's a linguistic basis. You can say, I am wanting, I am needing, I am willing. You cannot come up with anything that is other than this. You can come up with numerous bodily genders or these priorities, but there's 3. So the soul is said to be in the willing mode, okay, Jivatma. And this soul is in the willing mode, in the sense that even in the material world, when you say, I want something, it's not that you are really wanting. This is an experiment done in neuroscience by a person called Benjamin Libet. What they said is, they said that we will, we do measurements of when people say that I want this, I made a choice. They say the brain actually did it before that, right? So this is factual, that matter proposes and soul accepts. Jivatma accepts. So this is called entanglement. You think you want something, but it's not you wanting. It is the all these layers that I have described before, these layers are forcing it on you. Like you say, I am hungry. You're not actually hungry. Your stomach is sending a signal saying that I am hungry, going to the mind and going all the way up to the stack. You can say there's a stack. It goes all the way up the stack, and then it says, I want you to take actions. Okay, do it. Right? Just like you can think of the ministry in a government. Where lower level person says, I want, and finally the bureaucrat, secretary, whatever, they are harassing the minister to say that we want to do this. Minister finally gives up and says, okay, fine, do it. This is the condition. So the choice of the jiva is simply willing. Like your mother wants to feed you food. I don't want to eat, I don't need to eat, but I will eat. Okay. So these two are when I want to, then from this willing position, I go to the wanting position or needing position. I will not do something unless I want to do or unless I need to do. Okay, that is called freedom. That is called liberation. Otherwise, if I am always, I don't want to eat, I don't need to eat, but I'm being forced to eat, I'm accepting it because I have no choice. That is not choice, is it?
Yes. Maybe that is happening because of biological, instinctual, or psychological compulsion, you're saying.
Yeah, whatever you can give. See, there are many words, okay? I don't want to go into the words because each word has to, there are a lot of contrary words to that. Each word is insufficient in explaining something else. Right? So I have something called forums.shabda.co. If you are interested, you can go there and ask questions. I set it up so that people have a lot of questions. They can come and ask there. So you don't need to do anything. Just you use a social media account and you log in there. You can post questions. But I request you to read first.
And I think they can begin with this Sankhya and science. This is fundamental work where you have explained how Sankhya can help elaborate, expand on modern science, or maybe solve various contradiction paradoxes that modern science is suffering with. Okay, so I highly recommend this book to all those who are listening to this. Okay, Sankhya and science.
I have just 2-3 more comments, if that is okay with you, Ram.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I have spent close to 30 years in this process, and every day I find new energy and new joy and new things in this. It never becomes old. It's not like it's something, and it is infinite. It is immense, and it is extremely rational and scientific. And we have only talked about theories today. Okay. If you practice, there are ways to realize all these things. If you are interested, once you become slightly convinced that this is correct, then there is way to experience everything. Right? It is not that everything is, imaginary and we are just talking about theory, because this physical experience, what you call, right, or the experimental experience, that is not all the experience. Okay? There are many levels of experience. This is explained very nicely if you study some Sankhya deeply. They say that there is a Jivatma, is like a person, and then there is Chitta, which is called goggles. Okay? These goggles, that you are seeing something through the goggles, and these goggles are dirty. So you are not able to see properly. Many things you are not able to see. So if you clean these goggles, then you can see properly. And this is not just Indian philosophy, even the West. Immanuel Kant, I can explain in some other session. What is this philosophy of goggles? So there is a perceiver who is wearing goggles, and these goggles are dirty. Because they are dirty, you cannot see everything. So the primary step is Cheto Darpana Marjanam, right? This cleaning the goggle, cleaning the glasses by which you can see. So once you can start, if you clean the goggles, then you start seeing new things that nobody else is seeing. And they will say, what is the proof? How do you know it exists? I cannot see. Answer is simple. You go and clean your glasses. Don't say I can't see this because your glasses are dirty. Okay, so in the same way, there is a process by which you can see. So first, we are trying to just teach some theoretical simple things. If you become sufficiently convinced, then you can take to a practice by which you can clean the goggles. When you clean it, then you will see. That is guaranteed. But the problem is, if there is not enough theoretical conviction, then we don't try to clean. So we cannot also see. So it's a step-by-step thing. Okay.